The stars were not just distant points of light in the sky. They were gateways to countless worlds, each with its own mystery, beauty, and danger. And for the human, this mission to a forgotten planet was supposed to be a simple exploration. But things had gone wrong, and now he found himself stranded on a world that seemed to hold a secret only the brave or foolish would dare to uncover. It had started with a malfunction in his ship. A sudden jolt, a flash of warning lights, and then a sharp crash. The craft had been old, but it was supposed to be reliable. The human had checked every system before setting off, but something had gone wrong. Now his ship was down, its hull breached, and communications dead. Alone on an unfamiliar planet, he had no choice but to find shelter and hope for a rescue. The planet was strange. The sky was a color he had never seen before, somewhere between purple and deep blue, with 2 moons hanging low in the sky. The landscape was harsh, with jagged mountains looming in the distance and dense dark forests that seemed to whisper in the wind. Despite the eerie beauty of the place, the human knew he couldn't stay in one spot for long. The temperature would drop, and he wasn't sure if there were predators lurking nearby. He set off, his mind racing with thoughts of survival. Food was scarce, and the only source of water was a small stream he had discovered earlier. For a while, he tried to keep calm using every skill he had learned during his years of training. But the silence of the planet was overwhelming. It felt like he was the only living thing for miles. That's when he heard it. At first, it was a rustle in the bushes, distant and soft. Then a sudden movement from the corner of his eye. He turned, and his heart skipped a beat. A figure stood in the shadows of the trees. At first, the human thought it was another person, but as the figure stepped forward into the dim light, he saw that it was something otherworldly. The woman, if she could be called that, was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her skin shimmered in shades of pale blue and purple, as if it were made of some kind of translucent material. Her hair, long and silver, flowed like liquid under the moonlight. She had large alien eyes that seemed to look right through him. They were a deep violet, and there was an intensity to them, as if she could see into the very depths of his soul. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The human was too stunned to move, his heart racing, trying to understand what he was seeing. The alien woman didn't seem hostile, but her presence was powerful, commanding. She seemed to radiate a quiet strength, as though she had been alone for a long time. "I thought I was alone," the human finally said, his voice a little shaky. The alien woman tilted her head slightly, studying him. She didn't speak at first, but there was a slight change in her expression. It was almost as if she was surprised by the human's words. Slowly, she stepped closer, and the human instinctively took a step back, his mind still racing. He had heard stories of alien encounters, of encounters that ended badly. Was he about to become another story? But then, to his surprise, the alien woman didn't attack. Instead, she extended her hand towards him, her fingers delicate yet firm. It was a gesture of peace, a silent invitation. "I am Mara," she said in a soft, melodic voice. Her words sounded foreign yet somehow familiar, as if his mind could understand her without truly hearing the words. The human stared at her hand for a moment, then glanced around, trying to make sense of the situation. He had no idea where he was, who this woman was, or if he was even safe. But the loneliness in her eyes pulled at something deep inside him, and against his better judgment, he took her hand. "John," he replied. His voice came out hoarse, but he managed a small smile. "John Clark." Mara's eyes softened at the sound of his name, and she gave a small nod. She didn't seem surprised by the introduction, almost as though she had been waiting for him. For the next few moments, the two stood in silence, each of them trying to understand the other. Mara was the first to speak again. "Your ship. It's damaged. I can help you," she said, her voice full of quiet certainty. John's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what she meant by that, but he had no other choice. "You can help me fix it?" She nodded once more. "Yes. But there is something you must understand, John. This planet is not what it seems. It holds many dangers, and I am not sure if the others are still here." The human frowned, confusion clouding his thoughts. "Others? What do you mean?" Mara's expression hardened, her violet eyes narrowing. "I have been here for many years. The others, they are not friendly. They will come for me, for what I carry. You must be careful." John didn't fully understand what she meant, but he sensed a deep truth in her words. Something had happened to this planet, something that had left her alone in the wilderness, hiding from enemies who sought her for reasons he couldn't yet comprehend. But one thing was clear. Mara was not just another lost traveler. She was something more, something powerful. And now he was tangled in her fate. "I'll help you," John said without thinking. It wasn't just the fact that she was offering help. It was the loneliness he had felt, the desperate need for connection in a place so alien to him. Maybe he didn't fully understand the situation, but he wasn't going to turn away from this strange woman who had appeared out of nowhere. Mara's gaze softened once more, and for a brief moment, John thought he saw something like relief in her eyes. She gave a slight smile, and that was enough for him to know that in this strange, terrifying place he wasn't truly alone anymore. John followed Mara as she led him through the dense forest. The trees around them were unlike any he had ever seen. Their trunks twisted in odd shapes and their leaves shimmered with hues of silver and blue. The air was cool but carried a strange scent, something floral but also earthy, like the smell of rain-soaked earth after a storm. John took in deep breaths, trying to calm his racing mind. He had never imagined he would be stranded on an alien planet, let alone meet a creature like Mara. She moved with a quiet grace, her long silver hair flowing behind her like a river of light. Her steps were confident, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings as though she was accustomed to being on guard. John could tell she was used to the dangers of this world, but it didn't stop him from feeling nervous. He wasn't sure what to expect. "How long have you been here?" John asked, breaking the silence as they walked deeper into the forest. Mara glanced at him, her violet eyes studying him for a moment before she replied, her voice soft but steady. "Many years. I lost count long ago." John was surprised. He had expected her to be a part of some intergalactic mission, perhaps someone who had been stranded like him. But it was clear now that Mara's past was much more complicated than that. "You're alone?" John asked hesitantly. Mara's face didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a tightening of her shoulders as though she was remembering something painful. "I was not always alone," she said slowly, her voice distant, like she was reliving the past. "My people and we lived in peace here, but that peace was shattered." She paused, her gaze moving to the ground for a brief moment. "The war came and I was left behind." John didn't know what to say. He had no idea how to respond to such a deep, personal confession. All he could do was listen. He had always imagined space exploration as a grand adventure, full of discoveries and excitement. But this was something different. This was the reality of living on the edge of an unknown world, surviving in the aftermath of something far darker than he could understand. "Who were you at war with?" John asked carefully. Mara hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Drellians. They were conquerors, driven by a need to dominate all who were weaker. They destroyed our world, and now they seek to destroy me." John furrowed his brow. "Why you?" he asked, genuinely confused. "What do they want from you?" Mara's eyes flicked up to meet his, her expression unreadable. "I carry something they want," she said simply. "A secret. One that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy." John was stunned. A secret? What could she possibly carry that was so important? He wasn't sure he was ready to hear the answer, but he knew one thing for sure. Mara wasn't just another lost traveler. She was important, more important than he could ever imagine. As they continued walking, John couldn't help but notice the way Mara moved. Her every step was purposeful, her body poised and ready to act at a moment's notice. She wasn't just walking through the forest. She was surveying it as though it was her domain. He couldn't help but admire her quiet strength. "Do you have a family?" John asked after a while. His curiosity was growing, but he wasn't sure how far to push. Mara seemed to carry so much weight in her silence, and he didn't want to press too hard. Mara didn't respond right away. She kept walking, her pace steady and unhurried. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "I had a family, but they are gone. They did not survive the war." John felt a pang of sympathy for her. He had never experienced loss like that, never had to watch his world fall apart. He couldn't imagine how lonely she must have been, living alone for so long on a world that seemed so foreign and dangerous. "I'm sorry," John said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. Mara glanced at him, her eyes softening for a moment. "There is no need for your sympathy," she said, her voice steady again. "It is the way of things. Loss is inevitable in this universe." John didn't know how to respond to that. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. He had heard stories about the harshness of space, about the battles and wars fought over resources and power. But hearing it from someone who had lived through it made it all feel more real, more personal. They reached a small clearing and Mara stopped. She turned to face him, her expression serious once more. "This is where you will stay. It is safe for now." John looked around. The clearing was quiet, peaceful even. The ground was soft, covered with moss and delicate plants, and the air felt warmer here. But he knew the safety was only temporary. The danger wasn't far behind, and it would find them sooner or later. "This will have to do," John said, though he knew it wasn't really enough. He had no choice but to trust Mara. For now, she was his only ally on this strange planet. Mara nodded, her eyes scanning the forest once again. "We will need to prepare. The Drellians will come. They always do." John nodded, his mind already racing with plans. He didn't know what kind of secret Mara was hiding, but he was sure of one thing. He couldn't let anything happen to her. Not after everything she had shared with him. Not after everything she had done for him. "Thank you," John said quietly, his voice full of gratitude. "For helping me." Mara's gaze softened for a moment. She didn't respond with words, but the look in her eyes said everything. She had her own reasons for helping him. And somehow in this strange, dangerous place they were bound together. The days passed in a blur of tension and survival. John had no real sense of time, only the constant battle to stay ahead of the dangers lurking around every corner. Mara was his guide and protector in this foreign world, showing him how to gather food, build a shelter, and stay out of sight from those who would do him harm. He had never felt so out of place, so helpless. But Mara was always there. Her calm presence, a steadying force. Despite the danger that surrounded them, there were moments of peace. John would watch Mara as she worked, her movements graceful and fluid, as though she belonged to this planet. Her silver hair, illuminated by the soft glow of the twin moons, seemed to catch the light in a way that made her seem otherworldly, almost ethereal. Her eyes, bright and intelligent, never stopped scanning their surroundings, but every so often, they would meet his. And for a brief moment, he would catch a glimpse of something deeper, something far more human. He hadn't expected to feel so connected to her. It wasn't just that she was his only companion in this strange, dangerous place. It was the way she had saved him, over and over again, without asking for anything in return. She was a warrior in every sense of the word, but she had also shown him kindness in the way she looked out for him. And that kindness, that quiet strength, was starting to break down the walls John had built around his heart. One evening, after a long day of avoiding the Drellians and gathering supplies, they sat by the small fire they had managed to make. The flames flickered softly, casting dancing shadows across their faces. The air was cool, and the soft sounds of the alien world filled the space around them. John looked at Mara as she stared into the fire. Her expression was unreadable, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. She had told him about her past, how her people had been destroyed by the Drellians, how she had been forced to survive alone for so long. But John knew there was more to the story, more that she wasn't telling him. He leaned forward, wanting to break the silence. "Mara," he said softly, his voice breaking the quiet of the night. "I know you've been through a lot, and I know you're not telling me everything, but I want you to know I'm here. You don't have to be alone anymore." Mara didn't answer right away. She looked into the fire, her expression distant, as though his words had struck a chord deep inside her. After a long pause, she turned to him, her violet eyes locking onto his. "I don't know what I've done to deserve your kindness," she said, her voice quiet but heavy with emotion. "I've hurt so many people. I've lost so much. And yet, you still stay." John didn't know how to respond. He had heard the pain in her voice, and it tore at him. Mara was not just an alien woman, a survivor of a destroyed world. She was someone who had been scarred, someone who had learned to live with loss in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. And yet, despite all of that, she had shown him nothing but courage and strength. "Mara, you don't have to do this alone anymore," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "We'll figure this out. Together." She didn't say anything for a long time. She just stared at him, her eyes searching his face as though trying to read him, to understand his sincerity. Finally, she let out a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. For a moment, John thought she might say something more, but instead, she stood up and moved toward the edge of their small camp. John watched her, his mind racing with thoughts of everything she had gone through, everything she had lost. And then, before he knew what was happening, she turned back to him. "I don't know if I can ever truly trust anyone again," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper in the cool night air. "But I want to. I want to believe that there is still good in this universe." The words hit John like a wave. He could see the raw vulnerability in her eyes, the quiet desperation for connection that she had tried so hard to hide. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something both of them had been craving for so long. Without thinking, John stood and walked over to her. There was no more hesitation, no more fear. He didn't know what the future held, and he didn't know what he could offer her. But in that moment, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away from her, not now, not after everything they had been through together. He reached out gently, brushing a strand of silver hair away from her face. The touch was tender, and she didn't pull away. For a brief second, their eyes locked again, and John felt his heart race. The air between them seemed to crackle with something unspoken, something that had been building for days. "Mara," he whispered, his voice barely above the wind. And then, without thinking, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a forceful kiss, nor was it rushed. It was slow, soft, and filled with everything they had both been holding back. Fear, longing, hope. Mara's lips were warm against his, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't alone, like he wasn't the only one in the universe carrying the weight of the past. When they finally pulled away, neither of them said anything. There were no words needed. The kiss had said everything that needed to be said, and as they stood there in the quiet of the night with the fire crackling softly behind them, John knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Mara didn't say anything. She just stood there, her eyes soft and filled with emotion, and for the first time John saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, something he had never thought he would see. The future was still uncertain. The Drellians were still out there hunting them. But for now, in this quiet moment, the universe didn't seem so cold and distant. Together, they could face whatever came next. The next few days passed in a tense silence. Mara and John had settled into a fragile routine, one built on mutual trust and quiet understanding. Every moment they spent together seemed to solidify their bond further. Yet despite the peaceful moments they shared, John couldn't shake the feeling that danger was always lurking just beyond their reach. The planet, with all its beauty, was also full of threats. The air always seemed thick with anticipation, as though something or someone was watching them. Mara, ever vigilant, seemed to feel it too. Her eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, her senses sharp and alert. She had never stopped being the warrior she was, even in the quiet moments. John had learned to respect her intuition. She was always a step ahead, always prepared, even when he couldn't see the threat. One morning, as the sun barely peeked over the distant mountains, Mara motioned for John to follow her. Her face was set in a hard expression, her lips tight. John could tell something was wrong, but she didn't explain. She simply led the way, her steps quick and purposeful. "Where are we going?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The weight of her silence was unsettling. "Stay close," she said, her voice low. "We need to leave the camp. Now." John didn't ask any more questions. He had learned by now that Mara didn't speak without reason. As they moved through the dense undergrowth, John could feel the tension building between them. He had no idea what was going on, but the urgency in Mara's movements left him with little choice but to trust her. After an hour of walking, they reached a small, narrow pass between two rocky cliffs. The air here was cooler, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of moss. It was quiet, eerily quiet, but Mara didn't stop. She continued moving forward, her pace steady and determined. When they reached the far side of the pass, Mara stopped suddenly. Her head snapped to the side, her eyes narrowing as she stared into the distance. John followed her gaze but saw nothing. The landscape was barren here, the rolling hills stretching out in every direction. Yet, Mara's unease was palpable. She motioned for John to stay behind her and crouched low to the ground. "They're close," she whispered, her voice barely audible. John didn't question her. He crouched down beside her, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain: something dangerous was coming. Mara's hands moved quickly as she began to prepare a small weapon she had crafted from the materials around them. It was crude, but John could see the deadly precision in her movements. He didn't ask what it was for. It was clear she was prepared for whatever threat was about to arrive. Minutes passed, each one stretching out longer than the last. The silence grew unbearable. Then, as if on cue, the ground trembled slightly underfoot, and the sound of distant engines reached their ears. John's eyes widened. He didn't know what kind of vehicle made that noise, but it wasn't something he had heard before. The sound grew louder, closer, until he could almost feel the vibrations in his chest. Mara stiffened, her hand gripping the weapon tightly. "They're here." Suddenly, from behind a distant hill, a group of vehicles appeared, their dark shapes cutting through the mist. There were at least 10 of them, moving in a tight formation. The vehicles were unlike anything John had ever seen. They had a sleek, angular design with jagged edges and dark armor plating that made them look almost otherworldly. They were made for war, made for hunting. John's stomach dropped. He knew who they were before Mara even spoke. "The Drellians," she said, her voice cold. "They've come for me." John looked at her, his mind racing. He knew the Drellians were a ruthless force, but he had never seen them up close. He had only heard stories of their brutality, of entire worlds being wiped out in their pursuit of power. To see them here, on this quiet planet, hunting Mara like prey, filled him with a growing sense of dread. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. Mara didn't answer right away. Instead, she focused on the vehicles, her eyes scanning the terrain for the best escape route. "We can't fight them head-on," she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "We need to outsmart them. I know this land. We can lead them into the caves nearby where they can't follow." John nodded, though his mind was still spinning with the reality of the situation. The Drellians were here, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Mara was their target, and they would stop at nothing to capture her. "We Have to move now, Mara whispered, urgency in her voice. The two of them moved quickly, heading toward the narrow gap between the cliffs. Mara's movements were fluid, almost graceful, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. John struggled to keep up, but he followed her closely, doing his best to stay low and avoid being seen. As they approached the caves, the sound of the Drellian vehicles grew louder, the engines growling in the distance. Mara led the way into the darkness of the cave, the walls narrow and jagged around them. It was damp inside, the air heavy with the smell of earth and stone. They moved deeper, the only sound the echo of their footsteps and the growing roar of the Drellians chasing them. John's heart was pounding in his chest. The cave was their last chance. If they couldn't make it to safety, there would be no way out. They stopped in a small chamber, hidden deep within the cave system. Mara looked at John, her eyes filled with determination. "This is it," she said, her voice low. "We wait here. They will have to come in after us, but we have the advantage." John nodded, his mind still racing. He couldn't believe this was happening, but he knew one thing. Whatever happened next, they couldn't give up. Not now. As the sound of the Drellians grew closer, the weight of the moment settled over him. They were running out of time. The cave was cold, the silence almost unbearable. John could hear his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in the darkness. His eyes darted nervously toward Mara, who was standing still, her body poised like a hunter waiting for her prey. She was completely calm, as though this situation was just another challenge to face. But John knew it wasn't that simple. They were being hunted by the Drellians, and if they didn't act quickly, they would be trapped. Mara turned to John, her eyes sharp with focus. "They'll come for us soon. We have to be ready." Her voice was steady, but the urgency in her tone was clear. John nodded, his throat dry. He was still trying to process everything. How they had ended up in this situation, how Mara had been running from these merciless hunters for so long. He had never imagined that he would be caught up in something like this. A few days ago, he had just been another explorer, curious about a forgotten planet. Now he was fighting for his life, and Mara's. "What's the plan?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady. His eyes searched the cave, looking for anything that might help them escape. The walls were jagged and uneven, and the narrow passageways seemed to twist and turn in every direction. Mara's eyes scanned the area as well. She was thinking, calculating, the gears of her mind turning rapidly. "We can't stay here," she said. "They'll find us eventually. We need to get to the higher caves where the tunnels split. We can use the natural cover to our advantage." John's eyes widened. "Higher caves? But how do we get there? The Drellians are coming in fast." John didn't hesitate. He followed Mara as she led him deeper into the cave system. The Drellians were still coming, but they were too far behind now. The winding tunnels provided the cover they needed to stay one step ahead. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the higher caves. The air was thinner here, cooler, and the faint sound of the Drellians' pursuit had faded. Mara led him to a small hidden alcove where they could rest for a moment. Both of them were breathing heavily, sweat beading on their foreheads. "We made it," John said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Mara gave him a small, tired smile. "For now," she said. "But we can't stop. Not yet." John nodded, knowing that the danger wasn't over. But in that moment, as they took refuge in the quiet of the higher caves, he allowed himself to believe that they might just have a chance to survive. The deeper they went into the mountain, the more John could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on him. Mara moved with the same calm precision she always had, but he could see the tension in her face. She was not as unshakable as she appeared. Beneath the calm exterior, he could feel the quiet storm that had been building inside her ever since they had first met. They were both survivors now, but for how long? John couldn't help but wonder how many more close calls they would survive. The Drellians were relentless, and even with Mara's quick thinking, He knew they couldn't keep outrunning them forever. They needed a real plan, a way to stop the mercenaries once and for all. But every time he tried to speak, to ask her what they would do next, Mara's sharp gaze would silence him. She wasn't ready to tell him everything yet, and he respected that. There was a lot she was carrying inside, and he understood that she needed time. They found another cave system to hide in for the night. It was small, with high walls and narrow passages, perfect for avoiding detection. As they settled in, John couldn't stop thinking about their next move. The quiet of the cave was unsettling. It wasn't just the danger of the Drellians, it was the quiet knowledge that they were both running out of options. Mara had set up a small fire, the soft glow flickering against the stone walls. It was the first time in days that John felt a moment of peace, even though the tension was still thick in the air. They sat in silence, watching the flames dance. John could hear the distant sounds of the night outside, the rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional crackling of the fire. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Mara broke the silence, her voice low but firm. "We can't keep running," she said, her eyes focused on the fire, though John could tell she wasn't really seeing it. "The Drellians will find us eventually. We need to face them." John looked at her, a mix of confusion and concern in his eyes. "What do you mean, face them? How?" Mara's gaze met his, her expression hard but determined. "I'm not going to run anymore. I can't. I've been running for years, hiding from them, but it's not enough anymore. If I keep running, they'll never stop hunting me, and they'll never stop hunting you either." She paused, taking a deep breath. "It's time to end this." John didn't say anything at first. The weight of her words sank in, and he could see the fire in her eyes. He knew she was right. They couldn't keep running. But the idea of facing the Drellians, those merciless soldiers, made his stomach twist in knots. What chance did they really have? But Mara was resolute. She had always been the stronger one, the one with the plan, and now she was ready to put it all on the line. John couldn't help but admire her for it, even if he was terrified. "You're sure about this?" he asked quietly. "It's not going to be easy. They're going to come at us with everything they've got." Mara nodded, her jaw set. "I've been running for too long, John. I've lost too much. If I don't fight now, I'll never be free. Neither of us will." John knew there was no changing her mind. The fire in her eyes was the same fire he had seen the first time they met, when she had saved him from danger without hesitation. Mara was a survivor, and she wasn't going to back down now. "I'm with you," John said, his voice steady. It wasn't easy to say, but it was the truth. He had come to care for Mara in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't just an alien from another world. She was someone he had grown to trust, someone he wanted to protect. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Mara's eyes softened for a moment, her usual guarded expression slipping just a little. "Thank you," she whispered. "I never wanted to drag you into this, but now I don't know what I'd do without you." John gave a small, reassuring smile. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Together." The next few hours were spent planning. Mara explained her idea to John. They would use the cave system to their advantage, leading the Drellians into a trap. Mara had been here long enough to know the terrain better than anyone, and she had a few tricks up her sleeve that might give them the edge they needed. But the plan was risky. They would need to be quick, stealthy, and most importantly, they would need to be ready for a fight. The Drellians were relentless, and Mara knew they wouldn't stop until they had captured her, or worse. As they finished their preparations, John felt a sense of finality settle over him. There was no turning back now. They had made their decision. They would face the Drellians and they would fight to the end. Mara stood up, her expression hardening. "We leave at dawn," she said, her voice cold with determination. "We move fast, we stay quiet, and we make sure they don't know what hit them." John nodded, feeling a surge of adrenaline. He was nervous, of course. This was nothing like the peaceful explorations he had imagined when he first signed up for this mission. But he wasn't about to back down now. Mara had been his rock in this chaotic world, and now he was ready to do the same for her. As they settled down for the night, John's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. But despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, there was one thing he was sure of. He would never leave her side. Not now. Not ever. Mara lay down, her eyes closing as she prepared for the battle ahead. John followed suit, but sleep didn't come easily. The weight of the coming day hung over him, the uncertainty of their survival pressing down on him. But there was something else in the air too, a sense of resolve. Tomorrow, they would face the Drellians together, and somehow John knew they would make it out alive. The first light of dawn broke through the narrow cracks in the cave, casting long shadows against the stone walls. The air was cold, and John's breath fogged in front of him as he sat against the wall, silently preparing for what was about to come. He could feel the tension in his muscles, the weight of the plan that Mara had outlined the night before settling, heavily on his chest. They had one chance to make this work. If they failed, there would be no second chances. Mara was already up, her movements swift and silent. She had barely slept, her mind racing with every possible scenario, every risk. She had always been a fighter, but this was different. This wasn't just about surviving on her own anymore. It was about fighting for a future, for a chance to live without fear, and she wasn't going to let the Drellians take that from her. "Are you ready?" Mara asked, her voice low but filled with determination. John nodded, though his stomach was in knots. "As ready as I'll ever be." Mara gave him a quick, searching look before turning to the cave entrance. "Stay close," she said. "We move fast and quiet. We can't afford to be seen until the trap is set." John followed her, his heart pounding as they made their way through the winding tunnels of the cave system. The path was familiar to Mara, who moved with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the terrain. John, on the other hand, was still adjusting to the unfamiliar world around him. He stayed close behind her, doing his best to stay quiet and avoid any unnecessary noise. The plan was simple, but dangerous. They would lead the Drellians into the maze of caves, using the narrow paths and steep cliffs to their advantage. Once they were deep enough, Mara would trigger the trap, a series of rockfalls that would block the entrance to the cave and force the Drellians to split up. It wasn't foolproof, but it was their best chance. As they moved deeper into the caves, John could feel the tension building. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the stone floor. He kept his eyes on Mara, watching her every movement. She was focused, her expression hard and unreadable. He knew she wasn't just thinking about the fight ahead. She was thinking about everything that had brought her here, everything that had led her to this moment. Mara had told him about her past, the war, the loss of her people, the years she had spent hiding from the Drellians. But she had never told him everything. There were parts of her story she kept locked away, parts that still haunted her. John could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting to reclaim something she had lost long ago. Finally, they reached the narrow opening that led to the higher caves. Mara held up a hand, signaling for John to stop. She crouched down, her eyes scanning the path ahead. "They're close," she whispered. "We need to move quickly." John nodded, his heart racing as they took the final steps toward their position. The caves opened up into a large chamber, its walls lined with jagged rocks and narrow ledges. The perfect place for their trap. Mara checked the positioning one last time, making sure everything was set. The Drellians would be coming from the lower caves, their voices faint but growing louder. John could hear the faint hum of their vehicles, the sound of their boots on the rocky ground. They were close. Too close. Mara turned to John, her expression determined. "Get to the ledge, wait for my signal." John hesitated for a moment, his nerves getting the better of him. "What if we can't make it? What if they—" "We will. Make it," Mara cut him off, her voice firm. "You trust me, don't you?" He met her gaze. her eyes filled with an intensity that left no room for doubt. He nodded, swallowing his fear. "I trust you." Without another word, Mara moved toward the rocks, her body blending into the shadows. John quickly followed, finding his position on the ledge. He crouched down, trying to steady his breath. His mind raced with thoughts of what would happen if they failed. What would happen if the Drellians caught them? He pushed the thoughts aside. There was no time for doubt now. The sound of the Drellian footsteps grew louder, and John's heart skipped a beat. They were here. The moment of truth had arrived. Mara gave him a brief glance, and John held his breath. This was it. This was the moment when everything would either fall into place or crumble. Mara raised her hand, signaling for him to be quiet. She positioned herself near a series of loose rocks, carefully maneuvering into place. Her eyes met John's for a brief moment, and then she moved quickly, triggering the rocks above them. There was a sharp crack, and then a loud rumble echoed through the cave. Rocks began to tumble, falling from above and crashing down in a deafening roar. The Drellians, caught off guard, shouted in surprise, their voices filled with anger and confusion. John could hear them scrambling to move out of the way, but it was too late. The entrance to the cave was blocked. John didn't hesitate. He stood up, grabbing a nearby rock and using it to climb higher. He could see the Drellians below, their faces twisted in fury as they realized they had been trapped. It was now or never. Mara appeared from the shadows, her movements swift and graceful as she launched herself into the fray. The Drellians tried to fight back, but they were disorganized, their confusion making them slow and predictable. John watched as Mara took them down one by one, her skill and precision leaving no room for error. But there were too many of them. "Mara," John shouted, his voice strained. "We need to move." Mara didn't look at him. She was too focused, too intent on making sure they didn't escape. But John could see the toll it was taking on her. The exhaustion, the pain. He knew they couldn't keep this up forever. "Mara," he shouted again, this time with more urgency. She glanced at him, her eyes flashing with frustration. "I can't just leave them," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Not now." John's heart ached as he watched her fight, but he knew they couldn't win this battle, not like this. "We'll finish it later," he said, his voice firm. "We need to leave. Now." Mara hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she nodded, the fight leaving her body as she turned and ran. John followed closely behind her, the sound of the Drellians' angry shouts echoing in the distance. They had made it out. But the fight was far from over.